Next, let's take a look at the indoctrination system of the communists, the Prussian educational system, and outcome-based education, which was eventually adopted by just about every nation of Europe and eventually the United States. The Prussian educational system was established in Prussia as a result of educational reforms in the late 18th and early 19th century and has had widespread influence since. The Prussian education system was introduced in the late 18th century and was significantly enhanced after Prussia's defeat in the Napoleonic Wars. The Prussian educational reforms inspired similar changes in other countries, and variations of it remain in widespread use today under various names. Characteristics of the Prussian education system included compulsory attendance, national testing for all students, a prescribed national curriculum for each grade, and mandatory kindergarten, all hallmarks of the modern U.S. educational system. It soon widely inspired educational models in other German states and a number of other countries, including Japan and, of course, the United States. State-oriented mass education systems were instituted in the 19th century throughout the rest of Europe. The Prussian reforms in education spread quickly throughout Europe, particularly after the French Revolution. This form of public education was subsequently widely institutionalized throughout the world and developed in parallel with nation building. The basic foundations of the Prussian education system were laid out by Frederick II, King of Prussia, from 1772 to 1778. Frederick II and others who furthered the Prussian system sought to take education out of the hands of family and transfer it to the state. Since independently educated individuals could not always be counted on to submit to government objectives, the Prussian system sought to create obedient soldiers for the Prussian army, obedient workers for Prussian mining, obedient civil servants for the Prussian government, obedient clerks for Prussian industry, and citizens who thought alike about all major political issues. Subsequent nation states that adopted the Prussian model used this so-called education system, which is an indoctrination system, to build a powerful controlling state apparatus. Variations of the Prussian education system were adopted by both Germany and Russia pre their totalitarian regimes, during and after their totalitarian regimes of Nazism and communism. In the 1840s, Horace Mann, the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, who later became known as the father of American education, traveled to Europe to study the Prussian system. Mann was seeking a way to change what he deemed unruly children into, quote, disciplined citizens, more like obedient citizens. After assessing the Prussian model as an effective methodology to implement state-controlled education, Mann's next step was to sell the Prussian system to the American public in the name of equality. This would be done by convincing each U.S. state to adopt a compulsory government school system to inform a, quote, uniform education, again, part of the Communist Manifesto, for the masses. The primary goal of this system was not intellectual development, but rather to condition the students for obedience, subordination, and collectivism. In other words, social engineering. Understanding these origins of mass public education, it becomes exceedingly clear why, quote, free education for all children in public schools was a key plank of the Communist Manifesto. The Prussian education system was the original model for what has come to be called outcome-based education, an educational model that bases education around desired outcomes for the student. By the end of the outcome-based educational experience, each student is to achieve a pre-planned goal set for them by the system. There is no single specified style of teaching or assessment in outcome-based education. Instead, all aspects of the system are specifically designed to achieve specified student outcomes. Thus, The role of the faculty in this system adapts to instructor, trainer, facilitator, or mentor based on the outcome that is desired. This model should more properly be called a system of indoctrination, since its main objective is to instill into students what it wishes for them to learn, rather than teaching students proven methods for truth discovery, such as the trivia method, which was removed from public schooling. It could be correctly described as what to learn instead of how to learn. Outcome-based educational methods have been adopted in education systems around the entire modern world, including the United States, which has had an outcome-based education program in place since 1994, at least.
And if you want to talk about the history, that goes back to the onset of the public school system, because there was always school to some degree. There was always education. People always learned. But when we began the system that we have today, yes, it was based on a Prussian system, and the entire purpose of the Prussian system was to indoctrinate people. And that is what our system is based on today. And it successfully does that. The general concept, and this is what people really need to know. If you don't want to do the rest of the research on your own or whatever, or just to verify what we're saying, this is what you really need to know, is that it is based on a Prussian model, and it was introduced by businessmen, not teachers, not educators, but businessmen at the end of the 1800s, just around the turn of the century, just around the rise of the Industrial Revolution. And what they wanted to do, their purpose, was to create a citizenry of consumers and obedient citizens. And in many different articles and many different finds that you find in papers and documents, some of them are actually quoted as having used those words, obedient citizens and consumers. And they wanted to train the large majority of the population to be factory workers, so that they can fill their new industry with menial workers. Because anybody that had that possessed any great deal of intelligence and went on to university to become doctors and lawyers, and they weren't looking for, with the Industrial Revolution, they weren't looking for another Renaissance. They were looking to suppress intelligence so that people would be okay with menial factory jobs. And they needed a lot of people to fill those positions because factories were booming. They were exploding because the Industrial Revolution was exploding. And it also would reduce the amount of competition that they had, which inadvertently would allow for monopolization. So I say this, and I know that there are people out there that when I say these things, you know, that what I talked about before, that antenna goes up, it challenges everything we think, and we say, okay, cuckoo, but let's stop and think about this, about what I just said for a second. Has it not been successful? And if you look at the way society is today, it has. So clearly the proof is in the pudding, because here we are. So there really isn't any, it's not far reaching. It's really a very simple concept to wrap your brain around. And at the time, that's what they wanted. That's exactly what they wanted. And it's really very simple. It's not otherworldly. They were businessmen. They wanted to improve their businesses. So they wanted to adopt this Prussian model of education because they felt that it was a really great way to train people and to train large amounts of people from childhood. And when they introduced it, at first the politicians rejected it because they felt that it violated liberty. They felt that it violated individual freedom and self-expression, and they felt that the current system of learning was just fine. Community schoolhouses, and most people self-educated. A lot of families taught their children themselves. So they pushed it along as, well, what about the children who aren't learning? What about the children in farmlands that their parents are not educated and they don't have access to education? And that's kind of how they began to sell it at first. Interestingly, most of the states, as far as the early 1900s, most of the states were still rejecting the system. And the first state to accept it was Massachusetts, which I find very ironic. Mm-hmm. And they did so, the politicians did so thanks to bribing and cajoling by the by the businessmen that wanted to push it along. President Wilson was in a meeting with these businessmen, and he had been quoted as saying, what we want to, I don't remember the exact quote, but I actually have it in the first chapter of my book, the history. And he basically explained what I had explained before, that we want a vast majority of the population to be trained for these tasks, and we want a smaller amount of the population to have liberal education. And by liberal, before the word was hijacked, I don't mean leftist and democratic. What I mean is it actually refers to classical education, which is critical thinking and logic.
Exactly.
So they wanted to reduce the amount of people that had any kind of experience with critical thinking and logic. And now today in the school system, critical thinking and logic are not part of the agenda. They're not really part of what is being taught. It's really about the process and not about the person. Because like you said, that was the perfect example, what was in the history textbook. Now, regardless of how we personally feel about Bush's role in 9/11, or what we have come to believe about the events surrounding 9/11, that should not be posed in a book in an opinionated way.
Exactly.
It should be the facts. Children should be taught, this is what happened. These are the different versions of what happened. Now it's up to you to make up your mind. But that's not what is encouraged in school. They are not encouraged to make up their own mind. They are encouraged to memorize the dates and facts that are given to them and then regurgitate them onto a piece of paper and then move along.